Okay. Right, everyone. Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a developer at Dado, but I'm also sort of I don't know what you can call it, maybe a content creator for FEDSA, which is front-end development South Africa. Skulk, who's joined us today, he's very knowledgeable about all things web development. I believe he started it with quite a few other people. I'm not 100% sure about the history of that. So we want to be having a session every Monday between 5 and 6, where we just sort of trying to mentor people, because it's sort of a missing gap there when it comes to web development, and it's it can really accelerate the learning of web development. I'm a little bit sick, as mentioned earlier, so I'm sorry if I'm just a little bit sluggish, but everything should be good. Right, so let me start screen sharing, and today we're going to be discussing Flex as well as just sort of the display property. Okay, so Tamira just asked now about. Just wait for it to start sharing. Okay, Tamira asked about when do you use Flex and when do you actually want to use Grid. So there's sort of a rule of thumb, and it's actually quite basic. When you want to have a two-dimensional, let me actually show the axis here. If you actually want to have a two-dimensional layout, then you typically want to use Flex. If you want something more complex, where it's not just going to be going up and down, then you would then start going and using Grid. Usually you would usually try and get everything done in Flex before you'd want to resort to Grid, because the browser support wasn't that high. So let's just actually have a look at it now quickly. So you would normally have people saying don't use Grid, like try and achieve everything you can with Flex. So that's why you'll see libraries like Material UI. They're actually using Flex to obtain what they can with Grid. But if you look now, this is a website, by the way, called caniuse.com. You should always be using this. What it does, let me just zoom in a tiny bit, is it shows you look at this line here where the background is slightly a different color. It shows you which versions, well, the latest versions for these browsers, and whether that CSS property is actually supported. So you generally don't care sort of about Opera Mini. And Badu browser, never even come across that. And then IE, we try not support that anymore. So generally, if you look at it here and you see this green across here, that means this is safe to use. So in the past, it wasn't actually supported by every browser, or not all the features were supported. So you would try and use Flex to do what you could, and then as a last resort, use Grid. But it's changed now. Now you're sort of safe to use Grid, as far as I understand. Skull can maybe chime in there and say that maybe if that's correct or not, but that's my current understanding of it. So as I mentioned, yeah, that's if it's two-dimensional like this, then you would just go and use Flex. There's no need to go and actually use Grid. But if it starts anything further than this, then that's when you want to start using Grid. As mentioned, it's two-dimensional, so it means things are either going to go in one direction like this, or something's going to go in one direction. And so that's that limitation of Flex. Maybe in Grid, you actually want it to go across like this, and you also want it to come down. Now that's going to be your use case for Grid, because that's not like your two-dimensional, two-directional, or more like one direction, that Flex is sort of bound by. Okay, Tamira, is there any other questions or any uncertainties that you have in regarding to Flex or Grid?
No,
Okay.
thank you.
Right. I'm going to have the exact same tool available also as Grid, but it'll just be like the UI will be a lot better. I'll pay someone to come and do the UI for me. Okay, so Skog says he generates a super basic fallback for the 0.1 users that don't have browsers that support CSS Grid. Yeah, so yeah, like mentioned in the past, it wasn't as widely supported, so you'd have to try and always always use Flex to achieve what you could. So that meant a Flex container within a Flex container within a Flex container within a Flex container. But now, just you can actually use Grid and sort of feel happy about it. Okay, so I bought this tool out. So let's just go and just look at some basic features in regarding to Flex. So this, just in case you are curious, this is built in React, which is a UI library. It lets you sort of manage state very easily, and update your user interface quite easily. Okay, so let me just turn all of this off. So generally, when you've got Flex, it's going in one direction. By default, it's going in a row. So it's basically what you would go and type in display Flex, and it would then sort of activate Flex from the default block. Usually there's just block like this is like the default. When you're going, you're typing div, which I think stands for division. It would usually just have this default, which is your block that goes across like this. So flex is sort of like a magical type of container where it goes and arranges your content depending on the properties that you're giving it. So that's what these sort of properties over here. Okay, so the basics that you've got. Well, let me actually look at the axis. The stuff flows either on one of the two axes. It's either on the main axis, which is going horizontal here, or you can actually change the direction. So I've changed the direction there, and I guess in that case, it's not actually flowing on that. Sorry, I shouldn't have actually said that. When you're actually switching from row to column, it's actually rotating the main axis, but I'm jumping ahead. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so let's start from the top. When it comes to your content, you've got a variety of different options that you can choose that will change how the stuff is laid out on the main axis, which is this blue line over here. So, for example, when it starts off, it's got flex start. You can then align your content in the center, and you can also align it at the flex end. But there's a bit more to it, so that, for example, if you had a set of cards and all of that, you can add space between. So there's space between each of the elements, or you can have space around. So you can see there's actually space on either side of the elements, or you can even out that space so the space is exact for each on the outside as well as the inside. Okay. You quite often you actually need to lay your stuff in a downwards pattern. So generally what you would do then is you would use flex direction. So flex direction is the direction that the content is basically flowing in on this main axis. Now, this does get sort of a little bit confusing because of my graph and all of that. But with experience, you'll see that it's sort of nothing to worry about. Is that when you're actually changing from flex direction to row, let's just mute this. So you can change the flex direction, the content flowing from a row like it is on default to going sort of up and down. And you do that using the flex direction property. So I'm going to click column here, and you can see that it's now flowing up and down. It's not actually flowing on the other axis. This is sort of more of your high level stuff when it comes to flex. You don't really have to stress about this. But what it's actually doing is it sort of actually rotates 90 degrees so that it's actually still on the main axis. You'll see this blue line when I'm switching between row and column. It's actually switching. So when you're switching to column, it's actually still staying on this main axis. And now when you're using flex start and flex end, you'll see that instead of being sort of up top left here and to the top right, it's now actually going top to bottom, sort of on a vertical line, basically. Okay, so let's look at some other properties that sort of makes Flexbox really cool. So I'm just going to go and shorten this box so that things are going to start wrapping. And I'm going to add some children in here. Okay, so you can see that content doesn't break into the next line. That's because the default for flex wrap is no wrap. So there's a property called wrap, and by default it's got no wrap, so it doesn't wrap your content to the next line. But if you go flex wrap, it's going to start pushing your content to the next line like this. You can also reverse this, so that now the content's basically, you see, it's sort of coming from the bottom. My grid might not adjust to that. I think it is correct though. Okay, so when you're wrapping content, it now sort of gives way to align content. And this is one that tends to trick people because they don't think it actually works. But align content is actually when you're actually wrapping your content. So you'll see that if I've got no wrap on and I'm actually changing align content, there's actually nothing that's actually taking place here. Right. So when you're wrapping your content, you might not want it to be sort of this big line at the top here, and then it's sort of on this main axis line or 50%. There you've actually got the content over here. But with align content, what it's going to do is it's going to sort of stick the items together after they've wrapped. So I'm just going to go sort of through the different ones here. So you'll see that by centering, now they're actually positioned together with each other. And I've seen a lot of people try and do a whole bunch of things because I didn't know that you could align content like this. And I'm actually even guilty of it myself. So this can be very powerful once you've actually wrapped your stuff. So for example, let's go and stick it to flex start. So now we've got all our content there. That's what we basically started off with stretch in a way. And get your content at the end. spacing between it, spacing around, and spacing evenly. Like it's hard to think of all the different use cases where you get to use all of these different things. But like if you play those games that you get, like this Flexbox Freddy and all of it, you can actually achieve some really, really complex layouts. Okay, so I'm just going to switch to some presets and let me turn that axis off. Right, so I didn't start this session off too well in explaining justify content and line items, which I should have. And so justify content, let me have to put the axis back on you. Justify content is going to be aligning your stuff on this main axis. Now, align items, that's going to be aligning your stuff on this cross axis. They could have probably given it better names like justify main and then align cross. And it sort of gets confusing. So there's a trick that I saw on how to remember which is which, because people tend to not know which one to change. For a long time, I wasn't sure. To get it to go down, do I use align items or justify content? So I came across one person on Stack Overflow. He basically mentions justify content's a longer word than align items, so it's horizontal. And that to me was actually quite simple. At first, I didn't think that was actually going to help much, but that's what I always fall back to, is that if you want to remember which one is this line, just remember that justify content is the longer word. And so therefore, it's the horizontal one. And so therefore, line items is here. Okay, so if we want to move it on this axis, we'd use justify content. So let's say we want to center it like that, or put it at the end. But then what if we want to go up and down on this axis, the cross axis? That is when we are using a line item. So I can go center, flex end. And then there's also baseline, which sort of takes the content and aligns the content based on that, the sort of the children that are inside there or the text that's inside there. But I don't have that set up as an example. It's not going to do anything when I'm doing that. Okay. Are there any questions yet, or anybody, Skulk, anybody want to sort of add anything at this stage?
So the only thing is, but you're probably going to get to that, is that, justify doesn't always refer to horizontal. Sometimes it refers to vertical.
Yes, that's when you go and you change the flex direction, and it's actually changing. It's flipping the axes so that they've almost rotated 90 degrees in a way. So that when you actually flex start, now it's still on the same axis. It's just that the axis, instead of being, let me switch between them quickly. You can see that these colors are changing, and you'll see the rounding main axis and cross axis is changing here. So as Skulk is saying, it's not going to move always on horizontal, depending on what your direction is. And there might even actually be some other properties that switch it over. But so it's actually still going with flex end and flex start. It's just that the axis now is vertical instead of horizontal. Is that what you were referring to? I'm not too sure if it's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah. And obviously you can reverse as well. So when you reverse, then flex end is actually the beginning.
Yeah. So as Skulk is mentioning there, so we've got this. When you've got row, you can also reverse your row, and it is incredibly powerful. I promise you. Like in a moment, I'll sort of show you. So I'm gonna actually reverse the row, and you'll see now that the arrows. I've just put arrows here that sort of show the direction. So you can see now that it's actually starting here and going towards this way. So now it's basically, this is the start of our axis, and that goes across like that. And so flex start is actually this side now, and flex end is that side. Oh, that's even more confusing. Sorry, it's because I've got some other things going here, I think. Sorry, I was just clicking on the wrong one. Sorry. Okay, so then you can see the flex start is here, and then flex end is that side. So it's switching it over. Knowing all these different properties with flex, it can actually come quite easily to you, especially if you play around with a tool like this. You've got a visual representation. The real magic is knowing what you can actually do with it. Sorry, Christine, do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. Before you move on, I wanted to ask, when you want to use the justify content or align items, do you target the parent or the children?
This at the moment, and I should have actually put a proper label here. This is actually only applying to your parent. It's not applying to the children. It's even though your children are getting moved around, it's the CSS is being applied to the parent.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
But now I was actually going to get to that. So, is there anybody else who wants to ask anything? Otherwise, we're going to sort of also talk about the children. No. Okay. So when you go and you use display flex, it's applying those things to the parent container. So let me just go and sort of show you with just looking at the dev tools here. And if you don't know how to open this, it's Control-Shift-R. But you should always be knowing, you should always have that open. Dev tools is just that's your best friend. So here is the container that we've got there. When I'm actually putting flex on, let me actually click that on. It's applying those CSS properties to the parent. But the children are actually still impacted. By doing that, each of the children actually automatically also become, they also have sort of like flex applied to them. So that you can actually use flex properties on them, but not just justify content and that type of stuff. They've got their own flex children properties, basically. Please ignore this over here. This is just because so that I can lay out my content. Okay, so let's actually look at the children now, right? This is applying the CSS to the children is where you start getting the real sort of complex things happening and complex layouts. Okay, so you'll see here that on the right, and by the way, if you did miss it, there's a link for this exact app so that you can have it open on your computer as well while I'm doing this exact same thing. You'll see I'm in exact same URL. Right. Let me just actually post it again because I think that if you came late, it might not be there. Right. So these children over here, because they're part of the flex container, they've actually got their own flex properties that can be used, and that is order, flex shrink, flex grow, and flex basis. Right. So order is, as you would think, it's the order of the position where it is. Basically, where it is, the index of that. That's not a good explanation. I'm sorry. It's where they are in the container. But it doesn't work as in like, if I just make this order 5, it's going to pop in as 5. The way that the order works is it's based on any other ones that have an order applied. Otherwise, they just sort of go in a row. So let's actually go and discuss that. So I'm just going to add background colors to this so that it's a lot easier for you to see when I'm moving something around on the screen. So I'm going to take this first one, which is this chart over here, chart number 1, and I'm going to add an order. So I'll add order 1. Okay, so now you can see that it's actually gone to the end. It hasn't gone to an index of 1 or index of 2, index of 3. It goes right to the end. So I'm going to make chart number 2 also have an order of 1. So these two are almost like in a group. And, you know, because 1 becomes before 2, it's just gonna be there before that. So it's going to follow its HTML hierarchy for that like order group, if you will. Okay, so let's go and start throwing some more things in here. Okay, so what I've changed now is, hold on, let's get that. Okay, so I've got, sorry, just give me a second. Just trying to think of what I'm trying to do here. Okay, leave this one. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, and 1. Sorry, it's 1, 1, and 2. So you can see that now the higher the order, it sort of goes to its own little order group at the end. I hope that makes sense. Skok, is there any other way that you would put it other than like an order group? Like the way I imagine it's sort of like an order group for that particular number, if they're all together in that number.
Yeah, so like this is actually a case, where I would start looking at grid. Once the ordering becomes like really tricky, that's where it's a lot easier to use grid. But for just basic ordering, just moving things to the end, moving things to the front, moving things to the middle, like order more often than not is enough. Yeah. But if you're starting to do anything more complex and that type of ordering, you're probably going to look at something like grid.
Yes, actually, now that you remind me of something, and this is actually very important, is that when you are changing the order here, you are not changing the semantics of your document. So for example, when it comes to a screen reader, yes, order is a CSS property that gets applied to any child. If you see order here, that's only because I'm actually using it in my code, but it's actually CSS that it gets applied. You literally just type order. Let me actually put up the CSS here. Where is it? So you'll see here, yeah, it's actually order. You'll see that I've actually added all of the CSS properties whenever you're changing this so that you know exactly what's happening.
Is there like a maximum order? Is there like You can go up to 10 or 12 or...
No, I don't believe so. But you can do -1, and that will put you right at the beginning.
So -1 is right at the beginning and 1 is right at the end, and everything else is somewhere in between.
No, I think it's more like if you think of it as like sort of groups. I don't know if there's like application I can give you as an example. So when you start, everything is in group 0. So they all follow the way that they've loaded in. So I'm just going to refresh instead of resetting all of this. I could have actually...
I usually equate it to z-index. If you have any experience with z-index, it works the same way as z-index. So whether it's 1 or whether it's 9 million, the principle is just it's relative. So it depends on just which numbers are higher and which are lower. But it's not the number in itself doesn't have any meaning.
But the higher the number, the more to the left it'll be?
Other way around, the more to the right.
Oh, and so the reason that Martin had the 1s go to the right is just because that was the highest number.
It depends if you're reversed. See, that's where it becomes tricky. But if you're reversed, like it swaps everything around. But generally, the higher the number, the more to the end of the flow it will be, or of the flex it will be, and the lower. You can even do minus order. I think stand to be corrected, but I think you can do minus order.
It's -1 just for order is allowed. You're allowed -1. And
my bad.
That will go and stick you right at the beginning. Jonathan.
And so everything is kind of in a default group 0 until you actually specify a number. Okay, cool.
So I think Skulk hit it nailed on the head with the using z-index. It's sort of the same principle. So if they're all in the same group, then it's going to depend on how your HTML is loaded in, because it's going to follow this order first. Then basically it's like specificity, where by putting it on order, it's overwriting the way it's rendered in. But there's something that's actually incredibly important here, is that when you are switching order, your screen readers and your accessibility users are not going to get that order on their screen. So if this is really important, let's say this was a flow of an application and things were meant to go as step 1, step 2, step 3, and just we got lazy. We wanted to put step 1 right at the end. So let's just go and stick it at the end like that. When a person comes to a screen reader, it's still going to have 1 on the left here. This is only a visual change. It is not like an actual semantic or HTML change. So this you have to use this with a bit of caution if it's very important, and it usually should be important when people are, for accessibility reasons, that if it's maybe like artwork or something and you're switching this around, like, you just like, it's sort of like, let's just say it's like a photo frame or something, it's fine. That's not really going to get picked up by your screen reader. But if this was like an order of steps and you needed 1 to be at the end and you used order, people coming with their screen reader devices, they're not going to have the same order. And then that's critical failure of your web app. So you need to keep that in mind.
But in the same vein, you can actually use this to kind of assist like semantics and accessibility, because you can actually now, sometimes things make more sense semantically in a specific order, but visually in a different order. So what I often find is a lot of times you have a design where there's like a little like subtitle or something above the H1. But generally semantically you'd rather have like that paragraph below the H1, but visually it's placed above it as like a little subheading or something. And that's a case where I would just actually swap it around. I would in my HTML I would do the H1 first and then the thing that goes above it, but then just use Flex to swap it around visually.
Yes.
So you can actually use that to your advantage.
What Skulk has mentioned there, I think, is actually a great example. And if I can just expand on that and just use a card, for example. So say we actually had a card here. I feel like with a card, we'll actually sort of detail it quite well. So if we had a card here and we had our heading and then there was a picture. Always got to have your alt tag. Never not have an alt tag. And so Skulk is saying that you actually want your picture at the top and then your heading. But for semantically, you should have your heading before the card. So order is going to let you switch that, but it's still going to actually be the correct order for when it comes to the screen reader. Like I often come across this case, and to be honest, I actually didn't think of actually going and using it the way that you actually mentioned. That's brilliant. Okay, so did everybody understand what he was mentioning there?
Yes.
Cool.
That's cool.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So looking at the children again, I think we sort of covered the order here. Don't think as much that we can discuss. So let me just reset it again. Okay. So now what you've got is the flex shrink. Okay. What flex shrink what that does is when your containers are actually, your screen is actually getting squashed like this. Maybe you want one container to shrink at a slower, let's go with 7 maybe. Okay. You want maybe 1 to shrink less than 7 when you are actually shrinking your items like this. So that is where flex shrink is going to get involved here. And it's all basically relative. So by going and putting 4 on number 2, I guess I should do number 1. Sorry. It's my first time playing around with this thing, trying to explain. So I've gone and put flex shrink on number 1. Okay. It's now going to, relatively speaking, I don't know if you know the 1FR, which is like 1 fraction. It's basically saying I am going to be everybody's size divided by 2. Divided by this number here. So it's like a relative number. It's like 1/2 or 1/3, like a fraction basically. So let me switch it to 1/3. When I'm shrinking it, it's a third of it's a third of the containers of its brothers and sisters. So as you can see, I'm actually go back to 1. It's the same size as everything else. I go to 2. It's now half the size. So it's shrunk. What is the right way to put this in mathematics here? So it's basically shrunk. Let's go. I need some help here. So what is it? It's half of the container, right? Yeah.
So shrink. Yeah. So I actually, to be honest, I actually try and avoid shrink. I just go with grow. Grow kind of works in that way, in which, so grow is it assigns all the space that's required, the minimum space that's required, and then whatever's left over gets divided between all the grows. So if you don't assign a grow to anything, then nothing is going to get filled up. But if one thing has a grow of 1, then all the remaining extra space is going to be thrown into that one. If 2 have 1, then it's going to be split up between them. So it's also relative, So similar to the order and so forth. So you just specify what amount of the remaining space would be assigned to actual child. To be honest, I don't actually use shrink at all. I think you can do the same thing with shrink or with grow. I tend to just go with grow because it to me it makes a lot more sense. It's very similar to like a fractional unit, an FR.
Yeah.
Mm.
So basically, it's
so I actually can't help that much with shrink. To be honest, I never use it.
It's dividing. So I just needed time to let my brain unclog it. It's just a divide. It's like a fraction. So whatever this value is, it's a fraction of what the other containers are. So if it's 2, it's half. If it's 3, it's 1/3. If it's 4, it's 1/4. And I was just struggling to basically put that into words. Yeah, Jonathan.
And then practically this allows you to decide which elements should, let's call it, disappear first off of the screen if the screen size is reduced for whatever reason.
I don't think it's in regards with flex shrink. It has to be that when the container is too big. So you're not going to have items disappearing. You're going to have items getting smaller.
Yeah.
But it's only flex shrink will only work. You'll see that. Let me take it out like this. Nothing's actually happening. It's only ever going to be applied when the container's actually squeezing them down.
Mm.
So I'm not sure if that helps with your question.
No, sorry. I'm just trying to. Do you have a practical use case in maybe some development you've done where it might have been of help?
No, I have come across when I was learning, there were certain resources where they would show you how you wanted to use it. For example, if you had like your menu layout, I was actually going to build this out. I just ran out of time this weekend. I think if you had possibly a button that could have been in here, and you want that button to shrink and you don't want the rest of your content to shrink, then this is going to be shrinking your button down. Where everything is actually maintaining its size.
Yeah, but you can do the exact
You can
same
do it
thing
gr-
with Flex
yeah.
Grow, just doing it the other way around. And I actually prefer to use Flex Grow because, to me, like, I almost want to say conceptually, it fits nicer within kind of like a mobile first approach, where you start with the base sizing and then you enhance size as you go, instead of thinking about taking size away.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like I've just got it in here just for the sake of completion. And I think they've got a reason why they did include it. Like there are going to be some use cases, but I think like you saying, focus on learning to use Flex Grow. And maybe once upon in your life, you will actually be able to find a use for Flex Shrink, maybe somewhere along the lines. Okay, so let's now look at Flex Grow, which is clear is Skulk's favorite here. This is the opposite direction. You can think of this as divide. Flex Shrink is divide. Flex Grow is multiply. Okay, so what it does is it will have relative sizing the same way that Shrink does, except you don't have to be shrinking the container. So they start off as default 0, whereas Flex Shrink starts at a default of 1. So Flex Grow will start at default of 0. And now what it's going to do is, I think it's going to grow for the. I don't actually use Flex Grow that much, except for actually spacing that holy trinity. So from my limited use with it, what happens is it will use the remaining space to grow, and it will use it relatively speaking. So if I go and grow 2 components, right, you can see that these 2 have grown the same size. If I am to grow one with 2 and this one with 1, 2 is actually going to have 3 quarters, and this will have 1 quarter. I hope I'm right there. So I don't know, what is it, a third, or is it just more like a third? So Skulk, I think you probably have a lot of experience with this. I think you'll be able to explain it a bit more than what I can.
Yeah, so it's not in relation to the actual size. So it's the remaining size. So if you get rid of all the Flex Grows, your content won't actually go all the way to the end. You'll see like it doesn't do anything with the remaining space. So if you say Flex Grow 1, then all the remaining space is going to be assigned to that thing. If you give 2 of them Flex Grow 1, then it's going to be divided up, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So if you give all of them Flex Grow 1, then it's going to be divided up equally. But then like it's also relative. So if you give one Flex Grow 10, then it's going to get, in relation to the others, 10 times the amount of extra space remaining, and so forth. So it's essentially just speaking to how the space gets divided up, if there is any space left over.
No, I think that was a great explanation. Amazing. Okay, so any questions regarding Flex Grow? Should we expand on that, or did you guys pick that up? Yes, Douglas.
Yeah, sorry, I just have one question. So Flex Grow is basically not the opposite of Flex Shrink. It's basically Flex Grow is the remaining space that is divided up. Is that how I'm understanding it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so it's not the opposite, but you use it. You can take either approach to achieve the same ends. So the mechanism is different, but the like higher level, what you use it for is generally the same thing. It's just 2 different ways of approaching the same problem. So, but generally, I find that Flex Grow is just easier to reason about, and it fits nicer within kind of a mobile first approach, where you're thinking not about taking things away or like graceful degradation, but you're thinking about like enhancing things. If there is extra space, what do we do then? Yeah.
And I take it will work the same regardless of if you're using it on a computer to mobile device and that sort of thing.
Yeah, all of those devices are using sort of the same way to read your CSS and HTML. Each of the browsers will have their own rules of how they want to interpret the spec. because there's basically a spec sheet, and then each of these browsers need to go and follow these rules. But some of them, they think, oh no, I want to do it sort of this way, and I want to do it sort of that way. But at the end of the day, it's all going to be reading your HTML and your CSS. And just since you asked that question, remember I discussed this site here. If you go, this will actually show you whether something's, for example, on mobile not supported. Like Safari can often give issues. You'll see that Safari will look sort of like Internet Explorer, if Safari doesn't support it. Oh, there we go. So Skulk's actually got a list of flex bugs. This is great. So I need to actually go through this myself. So I think what this is basically, there's a problem and they found a way how to fix it, right? Using CSS.
Yeah, so granted, there's only 17. It used to be much bigger when Flexbox just released. But, obviously Flexbox is maturing now a bit. Most of them are quite niche, edge cases. But yeah, there are, in some cases, there are bugs. And yeah, it's just a documentation of the 17 bugs that can happen on some browsers and how to get around it.
Okay. Right, so now let's go and look at some really cool stuff. And this is where, like I was saying to you, that you can get really creative with your designs. And the stuff that people can make, I promise you, it's amazing. You would have never thought about it. Yes, Douglas.
I'm sorry, there was one question. What happens if you are using a different browser where this function is not supported? What happens in the actual browser then? Does it not render, or
it's hard to say how it's going to break. It might just not display the way you want it. Your page is most likely still going to load, but it's just going to look really bad. And to fix that, you could write a fallback, or there's a number of other ways that you could try and resolve it. Skulk actually went into quite a bit of detail in the last session for that. Skulk, do you just want to sort of just add in for the question?
So generally with Flex, I consider that a non-negotiable nowadays. Maybe 3 years ago, I would have said that, I think 3 years ago, we used to be a Flex where we are now of Grid, where it is definitely production ready, but we have that 0.1% of users that don't have it supported. Nowadays, I would consider Flex to just be a non-negotiable. If you are using a browser that doesn't support Flexbox, then your browser is probably not going to support loads of other things that I would just take for granted in a browser in 2021. Flex is the least of your worries. But that being said, you can also auto-prefix Flexbox. So there are kind of vendor prefixed versions, older versions. There's kind of a legacy one and so forth. These can have some weird behavior, but generally I would just consider Flexbox as a given. I think actually there's this weird paradox where I think actually Flexbox is, I can't remember what it was, but I might be wrong here, but Flexbox is maybe better supported than border radius or something like that nowadays. So I would actually just assume that's a given.
Yeah, so I don't think you ever need to be scared of you when you're using Flex. I think it comes down to that if it can't support Flex, then everything else is going to break. Okay, so let's look at the children now. So I think these are actually called, technically speaking, I think they're actually called Flex items. But I'm just calling them children because that's sort of a universal term. So we've now got, I think it's a line item. And this is now sort of like a line items like this, except it's now for the actual div, the child of that div container, the parent container. And they've automatically got this. So if you were to go and put any of this in, and as long as it's in a Flex container, it's going to work. So I haven't labeled it yet. So I only noticed now there's no label, but this is going to do a line item. And I'll just make sure that you can see the CSS when I actually do it. And this is where you can get really, really creative with your stuff. So you can do the same thing where, for example, we are moving content to the end and center and flex start and flex end. You can actually do it for individual items. So for number 2, I'm going to go and just put center. And for, let's just say, number 7, we're going to go and do flex end. I'm not going to be able to do baseline. I don't think stretch is going to work here. No. Okay. So you can see that you can actually position these things up and down, meaning you can get like really, really creative with your stuff. Like, I mean, I haven't sort of got the design experience to think of all the cool things you can do with this. Like knowing how to use these things isn't actually that hard. It's knowing of all the different magical things you can create with it that's actually is difficult to sort of eventually think about. Okay, so as you can see, these are line items. So let me just grab one of these so that you can make sure that. Sorry, it's at the. Sorry. Okay, so this property is actually a line self. I said a line item, but that was actually incorrect. So Tamira's asked, do you have to put all the children in a flex container? If so, how did you declare something a flex container? So a flex container is simple. It's you use just display flex, and then it becomes automatically a flex container. So typically this is actually this is actually my main container. Your default when you're creating a div is just block. Oh, is it going to let me change it? Okay, so the default is block, and you see now we've actually lost all of that functionality. Block is just a div container, a division. This is where you would now go and say display flex. And
if you've done that to the parent flex container, does that mean that none of the children, you don't need to put display flex anymore?
No, you don't.
They'll just
okay. Each of the children automatically become flex items or flex children. So you don't actually need to do anything with them. These properties, that I've showed you, these are actually automatically applied to those flex items. They're just set on default values. So already they've got an order of 0. They've got maybe that might not be right because of change. No, so they already got an order of 0, flex shrink of 1, flex grow of 0. And I think if you actually look at so it's computed. So let's show all of them. This is now. So I'm in the dev tools, and here's usually your styles. If you go to compute it and then you go show all, it's actually showing you every single CSS property, and a lot of it is how the default, your browser is going to have a default value. So those items are going to have these items automatically set for their default values, and you won't have to do anything for them to become flex children. You just need to I just need to go and put a div in here, and automatically. So for example, I'm going to add a child here. These are just divs that are getting added in. There's nothing else. It's just a div, and obviously with a number inside it. But there's no sort of extra CSS that I'm adding to it. But by being a child, they automatically get access to these properties, only because they're in that flex container. So the children get access to these properties over here. Sorry, Christine, you had a question?
Sorry, you actually just answered my question, because I was going to say, if those elements are block elements, does that mean that order and flex grow won't work? But you just answered it by saying that the parent needs to be displayed as flex for the children to have those flex properties. So you just answered it.
So it's like when you're applying flex to your parent container. Then automatically all children are gifted this wonderful gift of being a flex child. And you don't need to do anything extra to them. And then just speaking on that, you can now have sort of flex inception, just because you mentioned about that child having display block. When you normally create a div, it's automatically going to have display block. So these are automatically display block. Well, actually, they're not in my case because I've changed it. What you can then do is those children can also be display flex. And then if you have any children inside that, those can also be display flex. And that can go on and on and on and on and on. So it doesn't have to be just display block. The children don't have to be display block. You can actually have a flex container with a flex container inside that flex container. Okay. So that last one was positioning them, your individual children, moving them around the screen like this. And I can promise you, the reason why I bought this tool is so that I actually bought it for all of you. This wasn't sort of just for myself. This was so that you can actually try and learn with Flex. I highly recommend that you actually go and play around with it, because the stuff that you can get, it's really hard to try and wrap your mind around how you would do all of this. So I'm just going to give an example here, and there's nothing in particular that I'm trying to do here. I'm going to wrap it, so they wrap like this. Then I'm going to go and make one sort of have flex center, and I'm going to make one go flex end. So you can see like you're starting to get sort of some really odd configurations and stuff. And when you're looking at it now, you might be like, well, that's just nonsense. Who's going to display content like that? But with enough time, you'll see that you could actually get some really, really sort of cool, complex things that you can build using Flex. It's a bit hard to get to that stage. It's just going to take a bit of practice to get to this point where you know exactly what you or all the type of things you can achieve with it. I will drop a link a little bit later where, unfortunately, it's on my laptop. That I was hoping to actually show everyone is. There's a website that shows you all the different things you can achieve with Flex, and that should sort of spark some creativity, and then also just remind you, or just sit in your mind, so that one day when you are doing a project for a client or whatever, you'll be like, oh wait, he wants that design. I remember seeing a person achieve that with Flex. But as Skulk mentioned, that when things start getting complicated and you're moving them around like this, you possibly do want to be looking at Grid. To achieve it, it's probably far better. Just in all ways, it's better to be using Grid, and when you need to start moving things around in sort of like a 3D. Remember, Flex, I said you should be sort of a 2D direction. You either want to be going left and right, up or down, where Grid is where you want to go left and right and up or down, like a 3D space. It's actually more like it's actually 1 dimension versus 2 dimension. I actually had that wrong. Sorry. Flex should actually be 1 dimension, and Grid is 2 dimension. Sorry, I messed that up from the beginning. I'm so sorry. Okay, so the reason why I have gone and shown you all of these different steps is so that when I like to try and mentor people or teach them, I want them to be proper well-rounded education. I don't want you just to know the bare minimum to be able to make a product. I want you to know sort of everything a thing can achieve. So that's why I have sort of gone so far into this. Like, I think Skulk's sitting there like, bro, no one's going to be trying to build stuff, with your items sort of flying around the room like that. But so that's why I have sort of gone and tried to show you everything about Flex. So in the next session, I'm hoping to build out the exact same thing, but we will have Grid, and then you'll be able to move that around using tools like this. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes left, so I think we should rather open it up to questions, and then also find out what everyone would possibly like to be covering next week, which I think would naturally be Grid, but maybe there's something else that you would like to actually be discussing. Okay, so if you want to type it in, or you can use your mic, what would you like to cover next week?
I've just had trouble with media queries, so I understand the basics, but also like with Flex, when it gets complicated, then I'm not sure. Yeah, that when stuff starts to break or doesn't work properly, I'm not sure what to do. So just to go into that would be cool.
Okay, cool. Right, so we're actually starting to slowly get sort of some like a direction here. So if it's fine with you, what I would like to do then is next session we're going to do Grid. And then the session after that, we will then actually cover media queries and how you can actually use media queries to change your Flex direction and all of that. So for example, you have this layout, but as you get to this media query, you want stuff to be now at the bottom, or like whatever it needs to be, like that. And I think it'll actually fit very nicely into 2 sessions from now for us to cover Grid and Flex, and then we'll do the media queries combining the two. Okay.
Oh, that'll be very cool. Thanks.
Right, and then Tamira's asked, I'm not sure the use case of a 1-dimensional website. When you're laying out, for example, cards, they laid out in a 1 dimension. Let's just even go to google.com. Sorry. Yeah, we go. This is, you can see here, let me actually want to go back there. This is immediately in 1 dimension. If you look at this button, this banner, then you got the search bar, then you got this container with the stuff inside it. That's 1 dimension layout for this stuff like this. Inside the box here, this is also 1 dimensional. It's flowing left to right, and then it goes to the next line and it flows left to right.
Okay.
Right.
But if you would want something flying over on the left-hand side, then you would say...
You'd when you actually don't want things to sort of just follow a line. Like a 1 direction line. So possibly have these across here and then maybe 2 down at the bottom here. So it's almost like a collage of pictures. Let's get a collage here. So this is a really, really not not the best use example here. So, for example, this is now a two-dimensional layout. You've actually got stuff sort of going across here. You've also got content going down, and then there's sort of a picture in the corner there. Instead of just being the pictures go across, then they're wrapped to the next line, go across, wrapped to the next line, go across.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Skulk, anything in that regard? One dimension, two dimension.
Yeah, so that's often like something that like I find confuses students as well, and I often phrase it as it's not necessarily that you can't lay things out in two dimensions with Flex, like you can with Flex Wrap. It depends on like how precise you want to be about like what dimensions mean, but so I generally find the distinction easier to frame it in terms of Flex can only be aware of one dimension at a time. So you can either have it be Flex column or Flex row, whereas Grid can be aware of two dimensions. So you can order things in either dimension with Flex. But once you decide the dimension you want to use, you like that's kind of just like what you like that's kind of you're stuck with that dimension in terms of just like ordering things. So that's also the thing with like the order property. That's just linear, it's from high to low. There's no way to say I want this thing at the middle left, I want this thing to be the left bottom corner or whatever. It's linear, and you can only say start or end. Whereas Flex or Grid, you can assign like where things go by using both dimensions. So you can say at the top on the right-hand side or at the bottom on the left-hand side. With Flex, you can just order things in terms of a linear scale. But the thing is, because Flex can wrap, a lot of people think that like it actually is aware of two dimensions, but that's not the case. Like essentially the grids we create with Flex are essentially hacks. They're not grids in the truest sense of grids, in the same way that, all the stuff we did way back with floats and inline block and all of that, they weren't truly actual laid out content. We were using hacks to kind of create content that is laid out across dimensions. And in the same way, we can use Flex to emulate like things that are laid out across different dimensions, but it's in the truest sense of the browser, it can only be aware of one dimension at a time. It's very hard to explain until you actually start running up into these limitations. Once you start wanting to put something at a specific corner or something with Flex, and you start struggling with it, then you'll understand like, oh, okay, this is why it's so hard to do it. It's because Flex wasn't built to do this type of thing. So it's very hard to explain in theory, but trust me, you're going to run into it eventually.
And also spacing between elements in Flex it's actually impossible. If you want to have, for example, let's just say this is left picture and you want to have spacing on the left and spacing on the right, the nightmare you're going to have to try and achieve stuff like that. Where Grid is just basically grid, what is it, grid gap, and there you go, it's done. Okay. All right, everyone. I don't want to hold people up, especially for those who only have an hour to allocate for themselves. Thank you very much for joining the session. So next week we're going to be discussing Grid. I'll try and build out the exact same tool, be a little bit more complex. And then the session after that, next Monday, after next, we'll be doing media queries. We'll also try and do some clever things with Flex and Grid. And then I think after maybe a few weeks, we'll probably be looking at assigning sort of a project for you to build and for you to apply sort of all the things that we're covering. Okay. Right. Okay, so it's 6 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. If you want to hang around for a few minutes, you're more than welcome to. But if you need to go, that's not a problem.
Cool. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Martin. That's a very cool tool.
Cool.
We'll see you next
Cheers.
week. Bye.
Okay, I guess we're going to wrap that up unless any of you have any other questions.
Sorry, there's Martin. There's just one other question that I have. Flex is basically the same principle applies to using Material UI as normal CSS. Is that correct?
When you say material UI, let me just go there. It's a framework library. I think you might just have to explain to me what you mean when you said material UI is. Sorry, could you just explain that again?
Yeah, so Material UI are obviously used for positioning my elements. So if I had to use something like Flexbox in Material UI, would the same sort of principles apply to if I'm using pure CSS to using JSX or?
Yeah, look, it's all coming down to CSS at the end of the day. Browsers can only interpret CSS. So when you see things like SAS or SCSS and all of these other things, even though you're using SAS and all of that as a programmer, it gets transpiled or converted into CSS. You just don't see it. So it's more like we've got this tool to like use CSS in weird, strange ways. So I mean, let me just pop this open here so I can just sort of show you some of the styling that I've got here. So this is style components, and I can write my styling like this. And what's going to happen is that when my code builds, it will then turn it into CSS so that the browser can understand, because the browser can only understand CSS.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk.
Right, so now I hope it was helpful to you.
Yeah, I will see you again next week.
Great, Douglas.
Sure. Thank you. Cheers.